want to thank our sponsor, Planet Ford. Planet Ford has always been a proud supporter of law enforcement in the community, providing customer service and fleet management, sales, and service. If you're looking for that personal quality service, contact Planet Ford in Spring or online at planetford.com. You're listening to Crime Scene Today, where we address current and future issues in law enforcement forensic and crime scene investigations. I'm your host, Dan Zentek. Today we have Dr. Lawrence Simon joining us on the show. Dr. Simon has interviewed many serial killers and violent offenders and is full-time instructor traveling all over the world to speak to law enforcement, social services, medical, and forensic professionals. Before he was a full-time instructor, he spent over a decade in forensic settings interviewing dangerous men in the country, including inmates housed on death row. Dr. Simon been sought after by forensic and law enforcement professionals to evaluate and analyze complex major crimes. He's been a vital member of major cold case task force assisting investigators on high-profile serial homicides. He's also an author of well-known books, Murder by Numbers, Perspectives of Serial Sexual Violence, and Mortal Desire, Origins of Sexual Violence. Dr. Simon, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure. My pleasure, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Well, Dr. Simon, I got to see your presentation when I was at the IAI, and I just really appreciate you sharing the information. You've spent many years practicing your art, which is interviewing some very, what we would consider strange or deviant individuals but it also, it seems strange, but it takes up a lot of news shows. It takes up a lot of media and movies and everything. It appears that the American public, I guess just in general, people are interested in what we do. And I know when I've been teaching detectives and stuff, the one question that always comes up in these type of cases is the why. It's why someone would do this. And the analogy I would always give is that you're trying to interpret them with your moral standards, with your things. The fact is, they killed them because they were in a blue car, or because they had certain things, and that made sense to them. It doesn't make sense to us. But obviously, you spend a lot of time with serial killers and murderers and violent offenders and such. And I know that you had an opportunity to speak about some of these, and I just like some insight from you on some of the cases that you had and some of the, conclusions in interviewing so many people, and possibly what drives this behavior and I guess create sort of this type of offender.
When you're dealing with serial killers really as a whole, invariably you're dealing with a very rare and dangerous offender, as the prominent motive in these cases is sex. Certainly their crimes are so grotesque as having the rare opportunity to listen to some of their fantasies as I have. Really, I for the most part, I can't not help but conclude that these are adult monsters under our bed, with the serial lust murderer, as they're sometimes referred to, as the primary motive, as I said, is sex. Some of the commonalities that I've found in interviewing this population are indeed unique as much as their fantasy structure. And what I've found in pretty much all of them is deep-rooted in early childhood. So you start to see these things early on. For example, with Dahmer, he had collected roadkill, and he became real fascinated with looking at these dead animals in biology class when they were dissecting fetal pigs. That was one of the things that he was really interested in at that time. Also, a dead raccoon that his father had got from under the gutter area in the house, and Dahmer, became extraordinarily interested in that as well. And he's just one example, but I found, in interviewing these guys myself, that they actually fuse sex and aggression together at a very young age, and they start to associate basically sex with violence. And each time they masturbate, it's sort of reinforcing their fantasies. And all that happens is as they get older into teens, maybe even a little bit preteen, that these start to become obsessions, these fantasies. So
in some of the serial killers that most people are very familiar with, one that stands out is Ed Again, I know you brought him up at the seminar in reference to so many movies have been made off of sort of his crimes and things that he did. If you could sort of talk about some of those.
Yeah, and his whole ordeal had the relationship with his mom was very strange to say the least. During the bedtime stories, mom would refer to women as the devil, and she kept on beating that word like a drum with Ed Gein, the women of the devil. You can't trust women, and really, going back to possession, Ed's whole goal, really for the most part, was to possess mom, in a sense, become mom. And what happened with him is that really mom and his brother really kept him in check. Once, and it was really considered that he killed his brother. I mean, his brother ended up dying while they were out in the woods hunting, and it was found a gash where it looked to be that his brother was hit in the head, but they deemed it he died of a heart attack. And of course, Ed never got charged for it. And what happened in Ed's mind at that time, certainly it would have been, that, hey, I got mom now. Mom is all mine. But unfortunately for Ed, his mother had a stroke, because she was so distraught of what happened to her son. And she died shortly thereafter. And really, mom and brother kept him in check, because once mom and his brother had died, that's when he started really enacting, his behaviors of where the movies really were generated. Now, it was thought that he actually dug up his mom, and that's the movie Psycho with Norman Bates, because Norman Bates, of course, is Ed Gein, and they're trying to get that captured through Norman Bates, where mom is upstairs in the bedroom, but he actually couldn't get mom. He couldn't dig her up. He wasn't. It was a type of stone that was in the ground, but Ed ended up digging up other women. He would look in the obituaries, and then he would dig them up, and he would essentially use their body parts to become mom, essentially. And so that's the sort of the gist with him. And of course, when you talk about the why, really, if you could figure out what emotional purpose it serves to each individual to do what it is that they do, then you've come one step closer to understanding that dynamic. For example, I mean, if you pick a serial killer like Ted Bundy. I mean, Ted Bundy's a pretty wide-ranging. Folks know about him. He would kill women in a sense because he would perceive that they wouldn't want him. So it was almost like a revenge against society. You're looking at the different versions of why these guys. Jeffrey Dahmer, because talking about him, Dahmer essentially really didn't necessarily want to kill anyone, but as for him, his whole trouble came whenever his victims wanted to leave. So, he wanted a permanent companion. So what he ended up doing is drilling holes in their temporal lobe and trying to create living zombies, pouring muriatic acid into temporal lobe to create that permanence. And that's actually started, and all of this starts, and here's the key, and just mentioning these three popular serial killers, because there's a lot of literature on them. We know quite a bit about them. The grand whole idea about this is that this begins during childhood. Now, people will talk about child abuse quite a bit. Now, child abuse is not a cause, certainly not. What it is that trauma is perceptual. So essentially, these individuals do have difficulty. Nobody has a Leave It to Beaver, Ward Cleaver as their dad. Nobody has that. We all have difficulties growing up, and trauma affects people differently. You see, what may be traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another. We actually, may see that in battle time, where folks sometimes come back from the battlefield okay, and some may not. So it's essentially like that, where some of these serial murderers, when they're children, they suffer from pretty horrific type childhood. Some of them are horrific, some are not. You'd say to yourself, well, okay, that may not be too bad for you, because trauma is perceptual, so it affects us, all differently with that. But what happens is, at a very young age, sex and violence, particularly with the serial sex murderer, becomes fused. So sex and violence becomes fused. So they start to do at very young ages sexual pryings and things like that, figuring out things. I'll give you an example, like Jeffrey Dahmer. It was known that the only interest Dahmer really had as a child is when his father pulled a dead raccoon from underneath one of the, I don't know what you call it, but it's kind of like underneath a gutter area. And Jeff's face sort of lit up like a Christmas tree. And he became interested in these dead animals, so much so that he even collected roadkill. And so what happened at a very young age, that interest, that intrigue, started to get displaced, if you will, onto other people that he was interested in, with which of course were men. And in particular, he was interested in sort of a Chippendale, which he actually called, it was actually referred to it by him, a Chippendale male body type, someone that was certainly built, that kind of thing. And he was always interested in the insides of the body, and that was his, per se, his sexual interest. But his real motivation was that companionship. He did not want these men to leave. That's why the living zombies. That's why he was trying to create that. Matter of fact, his last goal was to create a coffee table that was made out of his victims' skulls, which he never really had a chance to accomplish that.
Now, would Dahmer try to kill his victims? I mean, was it when they wanted to leave?
So Dahmer wasn't as socially effective and outgoing as the other serial sex murderers are, like Bundy or Rodney Alcala. So really, he relied on drugging his victims. So now, once he had the victims in his lair or his kingdom, wherever he was staying at, he felt at ease and more comfortable socially as he fantasized about permanent companionship with the victims. So, besides his first victim, Stephen Hicks, once the victims after Hicks were lured to his home, the plan was to drug them, because Dahmer knew at some point eventually they would want to leave. So this is why he tried to create these living zombies, so the victims would essentially be his, certainly barely alive, because he's trying to create these zombies by pouring muriatic acid inside a temporal lobe. Naturally, you do this, you're going to end up dying. So, but Dahmer's intent wasn't that. His intent was to create these living zombies so they can be under his commands, invariably like sex slaves. So the idea of this term, which really is applicable to many of these serial sex murderers, is called possession. So that's essentially what Dahmer really wanted. That was the final outcome that he wanted. The problem is that with other serial sex murderers and Dahmer, they're rarely satisfied because of this intense psychological rush that it gives them each time they kill. Each time Dahmer had created a zombie, he had he had an urge to go out and do more.
I know the one thing that always stands out when people are talking about Ted Bundy is the fact that socially he seemed charismatic, I guess, normal or otherwise, which I guess always raises that concern back to the monster, right? Is that how do you know when they appear like Ted Bundy, when they appear to be a normal person in society? And that, I guess, is sort of a difference, that Dahmer was not really that charismatic type of person.
Absolutely right, Dan. Dahmer was not as charismatic as a predator like Bundy and Alcala or a Kemper. As a matter of fact, with Dahmer felt more comfortable when he was a kid, kind of being that class clown. So that's how he got attention. They actually called it in school because he would pretend having seizures in the middle of a class, and then the kids would say, he's playing a Dahmer, he's playing a Dahmer. But this is how Dahmer, in his own world, connected with people by being that sort of, that clown. And look, in reality, when he was out, he didn't feel as comfortable like a Bundy. And depending on the predator, like a Bundy, an Alcala, or a Kemper, usually don't know at all until it's too late. And that's why their victim count was extraordinarily high. And Dahmer had a pretty high victim count as well. But Dahmer was only as effective as he was because he was able to drug his unsuspecting victims in clubs. And he was phenomenal, probably better, just as good as any of these other serial killers like Bundy and Alcala and Kemper. He was excellent in telling someone what they wanted to hear. He was really able to talk himself out of being caught at least a few times. One of the, how effective he was at telling what I mean by telling people what they want to hear. His neighbor allegedly had come over to help him clean up his house because his apartment, because he was going to be evicted a few times. Naturally, because of the smell was probably emanating from his apartment. So his neighbor had volunteered to come over and help him out, and there was some blood that was on a part of the freezer. And the neighbor asked, Jeff, what's all this blood, here? What is this? And Dahmer always had an answer for everything. His answer was that I went to the store, I bought a package of meat, and I cut it with a knife, and it accidentally kind of got all over the fridge, and I didn't clean it up. I mean, he always had, he always had a very good answer for everything. So that really certainly helped him out as far as him getting people in a vulnerable state, even getting them back to his apartment, which was a little bit of a challenge that someone that doesn't have any kind of social acumen. But a guy like Bundy and a guy like Alcala and a guy like Kemper, these guys could seriously talk most people into their car today. That's how much charisma these guys, had. They were able to neutralize their threat better than anybody and get people in a vulnerable position without actually using like a drug like Dahmer did to render his victims comatose.
Even Otis Toole. I mean, Otis Toole, the guy that ended up, traveling with Henry the Lucas, he was described as having green teeth. So, it's not, he actually looked like he was, strange.
He was the one we all picture, right? He was the one you picture as the boogeyman you don't go get near, right?
Yeah. Yeah, right. And that's it. I mean, so you have some of these guys that, like you said, maybe Richard Ramirez. Yeah, it's that aspect where these guys are not going to be accomplished in getting their victims to a spot to where they can cause them harm, like let's say a Bundy or Edmund Kemper. And by the way, both Bundy and Edmund Kemper had IQs, above 130. I mean, they were literally geniuses. So, that also gives an advantage to these killers. And then you have social intelligence, and you have sort of the academic type of intelligence, and certainly both of these guys had enough to where they were able to get many victims.
Hey, we've talked about some famous, serial killers, and most people have seen documentaries and all that. But I mean, you've interviewed, I would guess, hundreds by now of inmates that the general public don't know. I mean, they're not famous by name or anything. What about some of those as far as that stand out to you? I mean, is there certainly someone that you've met that you've talked to that just by nature was just stood out in your memory out of the many that you've had?
Well, Dan, yeah, there was actually a couple guys. One of the guys, and actually both, have decapitated their victims. And there was one guy that was down in the basement where I was interviewing him, and that's, I refer to it as the basement because that's where some of the death row inmates we would go down there to do the interview, and anything that they wanted to talk about, we'd take them out of the cell, and then they'd come down there, and we just, the death row inmate and myself would be down there. The officers certainly would be outside the room. Sometimes I was down there so long that some of them would maybe go upstairs for a couple minutes or what have you. But one of the guys was uh, looking. He was staring at my which looked to be my chest, and this guy had decapitated men, women, and children. And he's looking at my chest, and I thought it was my chest. I said, "Do I have like a piece of food on my chest? Why are you looking at it?" He says, "No, actually, I'm looking at your neck, and I'm counting your heart rate." So that guy kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies, and I remember cutting the interview short because I do believe he was probably studying on maybe what I would look like with my head on his lap. So, and then another guy had explained to me how he had tried to have sexual intercourse with the victim's head and would refer to um, the I don't remember certainly what it's called, the area, the maybe Dan, you know what it is, where you decapitate the head, and then you have the sort of the veins or that are kind of right there at the base of the at the neck. He actually referred to it as wires. So he was trying to tell me that he was getting erect, but he was not able to get his uh, genitals into the wires. So I mean that guy gave me the creeps as well. So there's just I mean just telling you those two brief stories. Those two killers that had decapitated their victims certainly did.
Well, and I know that that's something that you teach because I know you teach to law enforcement and you have, 2-day classes you put on. And I know that that's something that you talk about. I mean, if you're having a serial rapist, you're having murders in the area, it's going back, checking call history, checking things that are in that area. And those are some of the things that you're talking about for investigators.
These serial killers, like anybody else that's committing, because these are sex offenders, they have multiple deviancies. And what you want to look for is important is the search warrant. And when you go in there and you search a home, you can start to see things that, if that's perhaps your guy, that you may start to see things in the home that are related to what you're actually investigating. And I caution folks all the time on this because people have pornography in their home. But if you remember the game hide and seek, I mean, it doesn't mean you actually did it. It just means that you're getting warmer. Yeah, case in point, we had a in the violent sex offender facility. A lot of the people that are housed there under the Jimmy Rice law, the Sexual Violent Predator Act. Um, we had a guy there that had underneath his pillow. It was a special article on the epidemic of child abuse. Now, this guy had a history of sodomizing young boys, and he was in the facility because he had left a 1.5-year-old boy. He was sodomized and left him for dead in a construction pit. And the only reason why he didn't get the death penalty was because the boy had survived. When the detectives had executed the warrant and they went in to search, the home, underneath his pillow, he had this bookmarked page that had this epidemic on child abuse, and there was a picture, very small picture, of about a 2-year-old boy that was badly bruised, and he was naked and covering sort of the issue, which was sponsoring this child abuse. And certainly, um, you don't have to be a genius to think, hey, this guy's probably masturbating, to this because it's underneath his pillow. It's bookmarked so he can get to that page that has the picture on it. You remember I talked in my class with regards to Ed Gein. Ed Gein would make the body parts that he had stolen from the grave site, and also a couple of the victims that he had killed. He had made body part. He had made parts. He had made silverware from the hands. So uh, and he also had in his home World War II memorabilia. So these are things again. I mean, another case that I had where there was a young woman. She was found on a beach and she had a beer bottle inserted in her genital region. And then they searched the home and found that he had some blow up dolls as well as one of these real dolls, which the real dolls could cost anywhere between $7,000 to $13,000. He had a couple of those as well, but he had mostly blow up dolls. And in one of the dolls, the expensive dolls, there was a bottle. It wasn't a beer bottle, but it was a Pepsi bottle that was inserted in the doll's genital region. So when you're investigating these cases, we know that you just don't have so many coincidences, and certainly that's one of the things that we do look for, and certainly the multiple deviancies. Leonard Lake, Leonard Lake, he was fired from a gas station because he drilled a hole in the girls' restroom and was peeping. And Russell Williams, the Canadian serial killer, he had an underwear fetish. So he would break into homes at first and he'd steal women's undergarments. And he had so much underwear that it was said that he went to when his wife was at work, he had burned the underwear in his backyard. Jerry Brudos had a foot fetish. And again, all these things occurred during childhood. Jerry Brudos's mother always wanted to have a daughter and would always talk to Jerry when he was a little boy, saying these things to him. Look, I wish you were a girl. I can't believe you turned out to be a boy. So what Jerry would do is he would go into his mom's bedroom and steal her high heels, and he'd walk around in her high heels when he was 4 and 5 and 6 years old. Mom was furious about this. She took the high heels, brought him to her room, and threatened him if he ever did it again, then she would beat him pretty badly. But of course, he did it. And then this time she had thrown the high heels out in the garbage. All Jerry did was go into the garbage and get the high heels. And he had so many high heels that were hidden in his room. Of course, in the very end, he ends up killing his victims, and he has them hanging from the rafters. And guess what they have on their feet? High heels. Of course, and of course, he was known to have a foot fetish as well. Bundy was a necrophiliac. He liked the body to be dead, and he also preferred to have sex in that manner as well, which was later reported by one of his girlfriends that he liked to have sex in that manner, where they were passed out, not even moving and not even breathing. So you certainly want to look at these multiple deviancies, and certainly because there's possibly other certainly crimes that are committed, and and again, I go back to Boyer. Um, these serial rapists and serial killers, they all have, in my experience, they all have they've peaked in their early teens, even to early adulthood. But you can't say, obviously, that all voyeurs are going to commit additional crimes, because there's just so many voyeurs. There's millions of voyeurs that are out there, and you just can't say that. And this is a very rare type of crime, obviously serial killing. So, um,
Now, do you feel that as far as the you talked about serial rapists and serial murderers sort of having similarities, I guess, in their actions, their desire, the possession, the control. So, would you say it would be, I guess, very I don't want to use the word normal, but that someone to be a serial rapist moving to being a serial killer is not a far stretch?
the commonalities in both these predators is certainly voyeurism, the peeping. But again, you can't say all voyeurs will progress to this type of crime, or really, or any criminal activity, just because of the sheer volume of voyeurs, as I was saying before. Um, with that being said, in my experience, both do actually have that background in peeping, and they have a similar thought process, and that thought process centers around this key word, and it's deception. And their belief system is pretty primitive, in that they believe that women are deceptive, they don't see what they mean, and they enjoy making men look bad. Pretty much, if you understand that premise with these individuals, as primitive as it is, then you really understand the thought process of a serial rapist and a serial killer that's targeting women specifically. And certainly giving you a couple examples. One example really sticks out is that working with these guys in the prison system, and if you really want to call it working with them, I mean, you're trying to kind of not cure them, but you're trying to get them to substitute their behaviors that they have obviously have done before into more acceptable behavior, obviously. We're basically learning behavioral strategies on what to do. So we're not really curing them, but I had in my office, I had a photo, just a benign photo. It was a workers' comp picture of she was a young female corrections officer who had looked like she had injured herself pretty bad, and there was a 1-800 number on the bottom for a workers' comp. So it was a workers' comp photo. And I had a group of inmates that were in there, and they were all sex offenders. And I had mixed actually, which normally you're not supposed to do, but we had done it anyway because we had pressure to start up this sex offender group. So we had some pedophiles in there, and also serial rapists that victimized adults. So one of these serial rapists that was staring at the picture, and I called him out on it. And I says, to him, what are you looking at? And he says, well, this is what I'm talking about. And he seemed to get pretty irritated, and I had no idea where he was going. But he says she's really not hurt. She's faking it, and she's cheating the state out of $100,000, and she's the reason why I can't have a damn ping pong table. And the other inmates, especially the other serial rapist, certainly didn't say anything, and then the pedophile kind of chimed in, and the targeting children, and says, "I don't see that at all." And I said, "Of course you don't. I mean, you're not." And then another guy that I had asked because he had raped a young woman after she didn't dance with him. He actually waited until the next morning, and she came out of her home, and he raped her. And I asked him, I said, would you have raped her if she danced with you? And he thought about it for a minute, and he says, no, I would have raped her anyway. And I said, why? She would have danced with you. I mean, if she danced with you, why would you rape her? He says, because she's nothing but a tease. So it's almost, again, it's almost like a lose-lose situation. So the hallmark is deception. For example, with Bundy as a serial killer, uh, he worked himself up with so much anger and so much disdain for women that he perceived didn't want him. So they were deceiving him because he believed that all women should want him. And if they don't want him, he's going to take them from the people that may have a chance to get them. So essentially, it's a revenge against society. That's really what was happening with him. And then again, the cornerstone being deception. So if you understand that concept with a serial rapist that's targeting strangers, a women, and a serial killer that start targeting strangers, that hallmark of deception, then you definitely have more of an understanding of of both these type of predators. And the last one it's only two words. So you got deception and you got recognition. So the aspect of recognition is another one. And we know that serial rapists and especially serial killers alike enjoy using sort of a hands-on approach when they kill their victims, whether it's manual strangulation or even, of course, blunt force trauma, stabbing. Of course, the most is asphyxiation. When you do that act, the act in and of itself is sexually gratifying for these predators because at that moment they are recognized. And both of them enjoy that aspect of it. They enjoy the hunt, they enjoy the entry, they enjoy the closeness. See, when they have their arms wrapped around the victim, even in a stabbing attack, a strangulation, they are close in proximity to the victim, so they get to hear if it's a stabbing, the gurgling, the crying for pain. These are all aspects of sadism, but the hallmark with both of these predators alike is the recognition. That's really what they're looking for, and of course, it's sexualized.
With all the different research that you've done, I know that you've authored two books, and one many years ago, one more current. So your first book, Murder by Numbers, you tell us a little bit about what's in that, what type of research was going on, things you were doing at that time.
That was it's sort of a beginning type to the newer one, The Mortal Desire. So first time that I really was introduced to that pathology. So I for the most part, would kind of glean my experiences from dealing with this type of predator and uh, put it down, into paper. Of course, not mentioning names. I was also work that I did with violent juveniles at that time too. I was working with the public defender's office in Miami that was jointly working with the juvenile sentencing project. It was a grant that really what we were trying to do is to help these kids to kind of divert them. So in a sense, they didn't become like a Ted Bundy, that kind of thing. So a lot of the murder by numbers had, things to do with my experiences working with not just the violent inmates, but some of these violent juveniles as well, and some of my thoughts on why they did why they do what they do. And I had a lot of influences from other folks as well, in that book. And the moral desire is essentially like um, it's sort of similar, but um, I get probably in a little bit more depth. I would say it's some of these what these guys have done, and I utilize different. Nobody's name is mentioned in the book, but it talks about some of these horrific things that they've done and the psychological background of these individuals, and kind of puzzling, putting these pieces together in going over with why potentially these individuals have done the things that they've done. And there's an appendix that I have in the book as well that has some of these sexual deviancies, what the description is, and actually cases that law enforcement, has come across, these strange type of things that really are undescribable. I mean, I could give you sort of one example that kind of pops in my mind where a guy was wearing female undergarments and wearing combat boots, and he was destroying cars. He was jumping on top of cars. That would be more deemed sort of a crush fetish. And unfortunately, a lot of times with the crush fetish, animals are utilized. And some videos, have been made, depicting that. It's really horrific stuff. But this was involving actually a vehicle, a guy. What you'll see, and in the book I talk about it, that there's usually more, any sex crimes detective, I challenge anybody that they usually have more than one deviancy. It's never just one. And I hate using the word never, but I have not found one time where it's just one. If you dig further into the case that you have, they're going to have, 3, 4, sometimes 5 deviancies. And why is this important? It's important because obviously there's potentially even likely other crimes that have been committed. Uh, paying attention to that, and I talk specifically in the new book, Immortal Desire, about animal cruelty and really what you truly want to look for in that when you're looking at that more closely and assessing violence potentially against humans. And the way that it's important to understand it is that an animal that has a limbic system and that's a part of our brain that sort of emanates emotion. So if you step on somebody's foot, they're going to say, ouch, ouch, that, if you do something to an animal, they're going to, if it's a dog, it's going to yelp, a cat's going to meow or what have you. And essentially the perpetrator is ignoring those cries for pain and is going on and committing, these crimes against the animal. Rest assured, especially when we're talking about violent bestiality, rest assured, I have not had a case yet where the individual was not thinking about a human. The only time I ever had that was in a prison where the guy was off his medication. He was paranoid schizophrenic. So it gives you an idea. They're not sexually attracted to the animal. What they're doing is they're imagining doing it to a human being. And that's why you have to really take this seriously. And, and a kind of a sort of an example I'll give to you. I do these homicide conferences. That's one of the things I do. And I remember this was out in Louisiana. I had a question where a young kid was driving around his bike around a parish with different cat heads. on his bike. You know, with a mirror. Remember those old mongooses back in the day, Dan? Remember?
Right.
Yeah, you have the mirror, and it was kind of this kid ripped off the mirror and was using these cat heads as trophies, and they were different cat heads. He's riding around the neighborhood to shock the people with these cat heads. So, the guy, the investigator come up to me and asked me, Dr. Simon, how dangerous is this guy? Well, you have to ask two questions. Number one, you got to ask, were these cats dead when he found them? And if they weren't dead, how is he killing them? What exactly is he doing? So come to find out, he was actually using, those clothes hangers, what are they called again, where you do the laundry in the back?
You talk about the metal hook hangers?
The clip, yeah, the laundry clip. Yeah, what he was doing was he was using the clip on the cat's tail and stabbing the cats and basically gutting them and cutting their heads off and using them as trophies. Now, I like to be a guy that shoots straight from the hip. So, I'll shoot straight from the hip and say, hey, that's coming to your doorstep.
Right. Yeah, that's not going away.
Yeah, I essentially will tell them that. I shoot them straight from the hip on that. And then, because, again, the more questions that needed to be answered were answered. That means that individual ignored those cries for pain because that cat was meowing. And essentially, we call it rehearsal. It's sort of rehearsing for what, possibly, and in this case, is likely to come to someone's doorstep. We had a guy that was raping. I don't know if I, showed it in my class or who knows, but he ended up raping an animal. Might have been a pig or a dog or what have you. But they interviewed him. And he was thinking about raping women. He was very open about it. Even got specific enough to where he would describe the genitals being the exact same thing as a woman's. So again, when you talk about these, and I mention these types of things in the book. But again, I always caution everyone, not every single individual is harming animals, although a great proportion is. There's definitely a correlative factor that you could say that, yeah, a lot of these guys have a background of abusing, animals. They certainly do, specifically the serial sex murderers, but again, not all of them. So, I'm always, because not everyone that I've interviewed has done that. So,
well, it does seem that there's a link between, certainly past behaviors, as you talk, precursors that you're looking for, whether animal cruelty, whether it's the suspicious behavior or breaking into houses for undergarments or just peeping Tom type activity. And then certainly also appears a strong factor is relationships with either caregivers, families, those type of things, and sort of their background history. I mean, it doesn't appear very often that you find someone who doesn't have some history in the past of things that were affecting them that lead to this criminal type behavior.
Because we all certainly have a past. The difference, though, between I believe these type of predators and us is that we have the tools, and believe it or not, some of these tools, and they're looking at this much more with regards to research, is brain pathology. What literally is going on inside our brains, as well as how we're able to navigate around these stressors, because we all have stressors. We all have childhood types of trauma. Nobody that I've ever met had a father, even though maybe on the surface they might have looked like that, but this might actually show my true age, Dan. But nobody had Ward Cleaver, as a dad. I mean, as the perfect mother, as the perfect father. I mean, it just doesn't that doesn't exist. But here's the key, really with these serial killers, which I've actually seen talking about their biopsychosocial history, is that they really had inconsistent type parenting, where they didn't know one day they're getting in the house whether they're going to get hit, whether they're going to get kicked out, whether they're going to get yelled at, or whether they're going to be ridiculed. They just don't know. They have sort of they just don't know what they're going to get from one day to the next. And another thing is, which you can't take for granted, And none of this certainly, and I always want to use that disclaimer, none of this is going to, just because you don't have this in your household doesn't mean that you're going to end up being a Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. Uh, but the relationship with mom, because we're talking about serial sex murderers usually target women, they're usually male. And of course, children are in there as well. Um, but the relationship with the female caregiver, with mom, and we call it an object relations theory, was it's relations with the parents, with the caregivers, how important that is. Um, the concept of mirroring. And I remember, just to kind of give you real quick, I remember when I was down in the basement, I was talking to a death row inmate, and I talked about how when I would come back on my trips or even come home from work, I'd pick up my daughter, and she was like 3 years old at the time. Now I can't pick her up, but when she was when she was three, I'd pick her up, and she'd see the love in my eyes, and then that love would be reflected back. That's what mirroring is. So essentially, it's recognition. So when we talk about, when these, let's say, from what I would find, is that these individuals that have their arms wrapped around their victim's neck, one of the things I'll ask them, what are you experiencing at that time, at that moment? And they'll answer it, just like it was occurring yesterday, uh, where their eyes, their pupil, they'll say things that their eyes fade. I like when their eyes fade, your pupils fade. I like hearing as they gasp for their last breath. I like to hear them shake. I like the way they look at me. So they talk about this as being just they can't even put it into words. How much power and how much gratification that gives them, even to the point where they might even ask you, which one guy asked me. He goes, "Think of the most exhilarating thing that you've ever done in your life. That's what it's like killing." So they're certainly putting it in to their own words. And again, talking about their childhood history, they're certainly missing, from what I've seen, is that mirroring. I guess the best defense, I know it sounds cliche, Dan, but the best defense that I would give anybody, and say it any day of the week, from what I've seen in interviewing these guys down in the basement, or down, just working in closed management settings in general with extraordinarily sexually violent men, the best advice I can give a parent, or any parent, is to love your child. Love your child.
Well, and we appreciate your writings. We appreciate your teaching and just all the uh, abuse that you put yourself through, and many times that we talk about, just same as detectives, that we like solving the puzzles. We like taking our knowledge and using that for a good purpose of solving that puzzle. But by all means, you just the same as us, expose yourself to a lot of information that most of the public never gets to hear, would never want to hear, and for the most part, we don't want to hear a lot of it either.
And anytime, I appreciate all the work you're doing, and obviously I'm pro law enforcement, and 95% of my clientele, and you're right, the things that we're put ourselves through, and what I've seen is that a lot of times we're not really known for our successes. And I say and some of the work that in my experience that I learned from the detectives is just unbelievable work that they're doing. And you talk about putting themselves through some of these toxic type of environments, and it's just amazing. And I've met so many people, and again, such as yourself, Dan, and folks from around the country, and even lecturing in front of folks from around the world. And the thought process really is similar. I mean, when I presented the class, it was the International Women's Association for Police, and there were some different countries that were in there listening to my presentation. And you could see they had some translators, but you could see that they were nodding their heads and understanding, meaning that it's just the thought process is a global type one, whereas they understand childhood trauma, understanding that trauma is perceptual, understanding that these things kind of do begin in childhood and things like that. But again, it's just a blessing for me to work around, these folks. To me, I'm blessed. So I'm talking about, obviously working around law enforcement and being around them, it really is a blessing for me.
Well, thank you again, and I appreciate your time. And certainly, whenever you're in Houston, we'd love to get together and maybe have another interview.
Oh, I'd love to.